You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Dailey and Kevin Laramée.
Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. And I'm hoping, much unlike the Singapore Grand Prix last weekend, that this podcast will make it through the first corner. And to help me do that is, well, the somewhat amused Kevin Laramée. Well, Kevin, do you think we can pull this one off, or are we going to take each other out and basically score an own goal like Ferrari did there?
Hey, I'm going straight. I'm minding my own business. I'm not doing anything I'm not supposed to. Why are you putting me in the wall, Mark? Why are you putting me out of the race? Let's start there, right? What a terrible first 2 meters for Ferrari.
It was, and after you had, well, let's basically backtrack. I mean, going into Singapore, we don't even need to talk about qualifying or the race right now. It just looked like even when they got there that they were on their front foot. It looked like it was going to be the perfect track to suit Ferrari. You go through the qualifying, and Mercedes just could not match the pace of them. It looked like obviously the only guy that was going to do so was going to be Max Verstappen, who of course put himself between Kimi Räikkönen and Sebastian Vettel, and it was all over once the race actually started. Lewis Hamilton was way back, and it looked like with Sebastian Vettel on pole and Lewis Hamilton back in, what was it, 6th position now to start the race, that it was advantage Vettel, but it was all over in the blink of an eye. Of course, it rains almost each and every day in Singapore, and it just happened to rain before the start of the race, so we started under wet conditions, and there was a bit of debate. Crofty and Martin Brundle were talking on Sky Sports as they did the formation lap, whether or not it would be a good idea to have a standing start or whether or not they should start behind the safety car. Anyways, it's all a moot point now because they had the normal standing start. Everybody started on either intermediates or full wet tires. And a couple of guys had some extremely good starts. Max Verstappen was one of them. Kimi Räikkönen had an even better start, but Sebastian Vettel had a so-so start, but not quite as good as some of the guys behind him, moved over to cover off Max Verstappen. Meanwhile, his teammate Kimi Räikkönen snuck up the inside, was faster than both of them, and as Seb covered off on Verstappen, he kind of pulled over and drew a little bit to the left, and the end result being Kimi Räikkönen clipped Max's left front tire with his right rear tire, and then ended up T-boning his teammate Sebastian Vettel.
It continues, and then at the same time, you have Verstappen turning and sliding away, and at the same time, Räikkönen goes back at him again, and this time takes him out for good.
and then as they continue down out of control a little bit into the first corner there, then Verstappen takes out the equally unfortunate Fernando Alonso, which leads me to the conclusion that both Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso are cursed and are doomed to finish the least amount of number of races possible in 2017, because that was disappointing. And I thought that Alonso was looking pretty good there. I thought maybe he should have had... Yeah,
he had a good car for once. It's not about the engine, but it's about the chassis, and it's about how it handles in those 23 corners. And once again, DNF. Not his fault this time around. He was just a bystander, but collateral damage. But it's unfortunate for McLaren. They did deserve better. But Vettel did a good performance here. But it's still, you have to feel disappointed for Alonso.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I felt honestly disappointed for myself and all the fans of Formula One, not just for Alonso, but just the fact that Ferrari's spectacular own goal there at the start really denied, I think, everybody of what was going to be a fascinating race between Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton. And you had to think that even though Singapore is a very difficult place to pass, just being a little bit wet, that it was going to favor guys like Max Verstappen and maybe maybe Lewis Hamilton to a certain extent. And we were denied that because the top three guys were taken out before they even got to the first corner. And then almost by default, it seemed to have been handed to Lewis Hamilton. And now it's a very, very difficult situation for Sebastian Vettel to recover from here, because Lewis wasn't challenged after that. Of course, his teammate Valtteri Bottas finished second, Danny Ricciardo in third, which kind of makes you wonder, why does Ricciardo have so much good luck and getting all these podium finishes, whereas poor Max Verstappen, seems to find new and different ways to not finish a Grand Prix each and every week, most of which are no fault of his own. And it's really becoming a depressing situation. But yeah, I mean, just going back to Vettel, though, it seems that with 6 races to go and that 28-point deficit that he has to Lewis Hamilton, that unless Lewis befalls some equally bad luck that happens to him in the next couple of races, it seems that it's going to be a very difficult task for him to catch up to him, because of course Lewis has not had any problems with reliability or mechanical failures basically all year, so it's looking good for him right now.
He had his bad luck last year, so I think he's all out of bad luck, so that means only good luck left, and that would kind of explain Sunday. And while we were talking, and then my screen next in my studio, I have my screen, and it's the Grand Prix playing. I put it back in the playback, and it was a start, and it just played on a loop. So, yes, you have the Vettel squeezing Verstappen, but he's not really squeezing. It's just going in front, making him not accelerate to his full potential, which gives Kimi the opportunity to be next to him, but not just that, to go way too quick, and Verstappen has to stop to not run into Vettel, because Vettel's covering literally his front wheels. And Raikkonen jumps on the wheels of Verstappen, creates the damage, and creates the chaos that ensues. So it's a mix of Vettel boxing in Verstappen and making him slow down, and Kimi going in fast, having a great start, but maybe a little too fast with that situation that's happening with Verstappen slowing down and Vettel making Verstappen slowing down. So it's either Vettel 100%'s fault or 70-30 Vettel and Kimi.
Well, definitely, I think that it's both Ferrari drivers that caused the whole incident. Poor Max Verstappen was literally caught in between the Ferrari sandwich and couldn't do anything. He was basically along for the ride. He was just trying to keep his car going straight, and he's getting squeezed from one side by Vettel, like you say, and then you got Kimi going around the other side, and of course, just clipping his left front tire. Just the way that he did was enough on that slick track. And it was funny, too, because when it all happened at first, I wasn't sure how much damage Vettel's car actually had, because there's just so many things going on. There's cars flying everywhere and people spinning off of the track. And then, of course, like we were just talking about, you have poor old Fernando Alonso come flying in late to the whole party and gets taken out in the first corner proper. But then you fast forward about 10, 15 seconds later, and the first real obvious picture that you get that things are not going very well for Sebastian Vettel is when you see him going backwards down to the circuit with his no front wing, and then he does turn the car around, and then you see the damage that is done to his left side pod. And of course, I think once he got out of that tangle in the first corner, the reason why he spun out is just all the fluids that were coming out, and it's a shame. It's a tough situation for him, and I don't know what Lewis Hamilton did or how hard he prayed on Saturday night, but I don't think that he could have expected a result that good. I know he said before the race that once it was raining, he knew he was going to win, but to have that set of circumstances unfold in front of him, I don't think even Lewis expected that.
No, it's unexpected. It's almost a miracle, and that's what Lewis mentioned before the race at a different outlet. I can't remember which one. But he was definitely saying, look, I'm going to need a miracle here to be able to achieve top results, and it was a godsend. Literally, what happened. Best possible scenario. Constructor-wise and driver standings-wise. He takes a stronghold on the driver title, and Mercedes finally takes a big stronghold on the Constructors' Championship with the 1-3. It makes a big difference, the fact that both Ferrari cars laid an egg, and it's terrible for the show. It's terrible for the race that we had because it was a procession from that moment on. Yeah, of course, if you go down the grid, there was some interesting move. Renault performed well, McLaren performed well, and that tells you the good chassis. So Renault are actually up and coming, so that could be boding well for both McLaren and Renault next year. But it is still, for me, a shame that we were robbed of a very fascinating and beautiful race under the lights. Let's not forget the under the lights part. It's so HD TV worthy. Like, it makes for striking images, and that lighting on the HD scale, on if you have a big screen and you're watching it, it's impressive, and it's one of my favorite races, not necessarily because of the race part. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a track with 23 corners. It's a battle for the drivers. But as well, when you're watching it, it's impressive. It's ADD approved, right? Where there's so much action, so many colors, so many things going on that you're just riveted to your screen. Not even watching your phone. Not because we always are used to watching our phone, but you're captivated by the moving images, and it's amazing, the colors and everything. So it's always one of my favorite races of the year, and we kind of got robbed of a great spectacle this time around.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. It is just one of those races where everything seems to work. Like you say, I mean, it's not really the track. I mean, the track itself is okay. I mean, it's pretty good for street circuit when you look at some of the other ones that they've used over the year. But when you kind of piece everything together, the exotic location, the circuit, the timing, the lighting, the architecture, you take all those things together and you do that. You have that race go at night. It just works. And for me, it's one of the most enjoyable races to watch of the entire year. And like you say, I mean, it's one of my favorite races as well. And once Vettel was out and Raikkonen was out and Verstappen, you just had to know, with that track being as wet and greasy as it was to start the race, that was going to be just the sort of conditions that favor Max Verstappen. So for all of it to go and then to start the race behind the safety car, I guess half a lap later instead of having it at the start there, it really took away everything, and it was processional. You just kind of found yourself really jumping forward. I found myself just skipping ahead through the laps, and it was very anticlimactic.
Full disclosure, I did the same. Let's be honest with the listeners here. I did use my 30 seconds jump forward button on my remote a few times watching the race on DVR.
Well, the one incident that I did have to watch a couple of times was when Marcus Ericsson spun out on the bridge there, and I still to this point in time cannot figure out how he managed to park his car backwards on an otherwise deceptively straight piece of circuit. But of course, the conditions had a lot to do to that. But there, of course, were many other interesting things going in and around Formula One and in the race itself. Of course, like you were saying, that there were many very interesting people that finished the race in places that we don't usually see. I mixed up Ricciardo and Bottas earlier, but it was Ricciardo who got second, Bottas third, and then Carlos Sainz career high fourth, which was fantastic. Yeah, and then another solid fifth place for Sergio Perez and Julian Palmer.
Mr. I don't have a car next year, Mr. All right, Renault, you decided to go with somebody else. What about me? What about Julian?
Yeah, that's a great result. I mean, obviously the guy's been under fire basically for the entire year this year. Last year, I think, obviously being a rebranded Caterham, or sorry, Lotus. I always still get the two former teams mixed up even now. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of I guess, a season in transition for them. But this year, everything is their own. It's their own car. And he just, for one reason or another, hasn't been able to pull it off. When he's had a good car, he just hasn't been able to manage the results. And then you have incidents like at the British Grand Prix where the car lets him down on the formation lap of all things. So it's been a long time coming for Julian to get a finish in the points, and to finish as high as 6 is really good for him. Whether or not he's done enough this past race or this entire season to get a spot for 2018, that remains to be seen. Obviously,
I think not. Not for Renault, for sure.
No, definitely not with Renault. But you often wonder,
the seats are getting filled now. Like there might be one in Williams, but Julian Palmer doesn't come with the same type of money as a Nico Hülkenberg or as a Lance Stroll. And Lance Stroll's been doing really well. Like, we're not even talking about it, but Lance Stroll's been very close to Massa, if not beating Massa on a regular basis now. And he's only 3 points behind Massa in the Drivers' Championship, and he's slowly but surely becoming more mature in the Williams car, and he's starting to be like getting like good performance out of the car. I wouldn't be surprised if next year like he beats Massa on a regular basis, who, if it's not Massa, it might be another driver, but I don't see Julian Palmer going there. So which seat? There might be seats available maybe in Sauber. We'll see if they come back with Ericsson and Verline. But where else will Palmer like land?
Well, that's a great question, and I believe that even Robert Kubica might be testing for Williams, so I would think that what with the names Palmer and Kubica getting kind of tossed up and around all the time this year, obviously Robert did a couple of tests with Renault earlier this summer and tested very well. That I was a little bit surprised that he didn't end up getting that seat for 2018, because there were so many positive things that were said by the Renault people themselves. But I suppose all the backroom machinations and conspiracies, or whatever you want to call it, with the whole Honda-McLaren divorce and the whole Renault switch, and then the Honda switch to Toro Rosso, and then the Sainz loan deal to Renault for next year, left Julian Palmer out in the woods, losing his seat there. And then I guess to a certain extent, Robert Kubica found himself standing when the music went off without a chair to sit in. But it's a great question whether or not Felipe Massa is going to come back for Williams in 2017. It sounds like he still wants to race in Formula One, and he'd still welcome that opportunity. But just going back to Lance Stroll, I totally agree what you're saying, that he's gotten better and better over the year. Obviously, at the start of the season, the gap between Massa and Stroll was fairly large, but when you look and compare them over, I guess, at least the second half of the season, maybe after the first third of the season, if you want to go back even that far, that the gap got closer and closer and closer. And it's interesting too, when you see that maybe Massa came out just a little bit on top in this race or in that qualifying session or whatever, but sometimes people will say, well, you look, but Stroll's way down, but if you look, Felipe wasn't really all that much higher. So I guess that really is more an indication of how good the car is. But I mean, if you compare them head to head as drivers, I mean, Stroll's really caught up over the course of the season. And so just like you say, I expect that if these two guys are racing together at Williams next year, I think that Lance has every chance and opportunity to equal or even better Felipe Massa next year.
Let's not forget his bad luck of the beginning of the season too, where he was the recipient of random cars flying by and hitting him and landing in the gravel pit. You know, we've seen this happen earlier this season for Lance Stroll, and that was a shame. Now, it was funny. I was watching a French TV show last night, Mark. It was on RDS, and it was called, it's a roundtable show, all right? And it was 4 drivers with Didier Scranton. Didier Scranton famously always drives in Formula 1600, and he's a TV host. He does NASCAR and other shows. But at the table, you had Patrick Carpentier, Alex Tagliani, Andrew Ranger, and Richard Spenard. 4, maybe not Mount Rushmore, because you need maybe Villeneuve and a few other one, but 4 great names in racing in Quebec's history. And they were talking about how you're looking at all those drivers and you're looking at everything that's going on, and it is a lot about money. It's a lot about, but they're missing still that fun and passion aspect. And I was looking at it, and it was fascinating to me when you're hearing drivers talk about the potential of cars and everything, but it's not that difference. And they were advocating cars closer to each other than the best car, and cars, like, they wanted the gap between cars to be similar, so you see the best driver. And it was interesting how they treated it more as a sport and as car guys. Anyways, I forgot where I was going with this, but it was a fun show to watch.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting when you see drivers sitting down and kind of talking about it from their own experience. It'd be interesting to see what sort of suggestions that they'd have to level the playing field in Formula One. We were talking, I believe it was just as recently as last week, about what was it, the proposed $150 million salary cap on development and
Yes,
and
it
basically
was
a budget
owner
cap.
Of Force India that was talking about his preferred number for maybe a salary cap in Formula One, which would kind of level the playing field.
Well, I mean, you take one thing as well that you see in kart where everybody has like the same chassis, and then you kind of go from there. It's just like which bits you bolt onto it. But I think what makes Formula One unique is that you just basically have each manufacturer, each team, they build their own chassis, and of course you have a lot of teams like Force India, Williams, and McLaren. They have like obviously customer engines. There aren't really too many teams in the sport besides Ferrari and Mercedes that are building their own engines and chassis as it is. But I think that's what makes the sport unique. And I know that there was even that debate last year ahead of the season, what with Haas coming in, it was basically criticized by some people that it was almost a Ferrari knockoff, what with the way that the rules are set up. Not only do they have a Ferrari engine in it, but a lot of the components in the car are Ferrari. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think that's what makes Formula One unique is the fact that even though that Haas has a lot of Ferrari components and an engine in it, the rest of it is their own design. And that's what sets them apart. I mean, gone are the days of teams fielding multiple cars. I mean, they don't even have the spare cars anymore, but I like it.
The famous mule, the mule in French. Well, that's a great segue, Mark, to talking about how we've talked about it in the preview show, but the Honda-McLaren split, and we're seeing the aftermath now, and there's a famous image in the beginning of the end of the qualifying where you see Honda people talking to McLaren people. Oh, they're laughing and making jokes and shaking hands. Yeah. No, behind the scenes, nobody's happy. Nobody's happy with the turnout of this, and according to Honda, McLaren struggled to adapt to change. They struggled to adapt maybe their chassis and everything surrounding the Honda parts to maybe get the most amount of potential. So Honda still willing to die on the hill that they think their parts were better than output. And McLaren are always and were willing to die on that hill a long time ago, saying the Honda engine was just not good enough.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting comment that was made by Honda's engine chief, Masashi. I'm going to try and say this properly, but I'll just go with his last name, Yamamoto.
Masashi Yamamoto.
Yes, before we actually did the show, I practiced this a couple of times, and when it came down to crunch moment, I still messed it up. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting how he worded it, and he compared McLaren as a sophisticated French cuisine, and then compared them to Toro Rosso, a team that he described as a delicious homemade stew and a growing company that would be more open to change. And it just sort of reading between the lines there from Yamamoto that perhaps what he's saying that the McLaren isn't open to change or isn't as flexible kind of made me feel like that one comment that you hear from people sometimes is like, well, I work for a company and my boss wants us to do it this way because we've always done it this way and this way works. And regardless if you can find some efficiencies or some improvements in making widgets or whatever that company does, that was what I took away from that comment by Yamamoto. So it will be quite interesting to see what happens when they're at Toro Rosso next year. Obviously a team that is kind of, well, obviously a mid-table team, and they're getting an equally big engine manufacturer in the form of Honda after losing Renault engines. So we'll see whether or not Honda can actually take that step forward with if they have a team or a partner that's more flexible and willing to work with them.
We're talking about Formula One. Formula One is French cuisine. Formula One is gastronomy. Formula One is molecular gastronomy, where everything is complicated, but everything turns out perfect because you take millions of hours to engineer everything. That's what it's all about. Honda, if you want to eat your stew and maybe your burgers and your fries and your milkshake, stay in IndyCar. Stay where you belong. Stay where you're performant. Stay where you're good at. You want to move to Formula One? You have to adapt, not the other way around.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that's the fact that they're still in Formula One and the fact that they're now supplying Toro Rosso for 2018 is much as political as anything else, because Honda is obviously a big manufacturer, not just of racing engines and cars and things like that, but obviously as for road cars. Yeah, it's very Japanese.
Yeah,
but
just sorry, it's going to sound terrible, and I don't mean to offend no one while saying this, but from what I understand, and I might be wrong, but especially in the corporate world of Japan corporate world, admitting failure and quitting is not an option.
Well, not only that, I mean, it's that's obviously probably a lot of it about is saving face for Honda. They don't want to look bad after they've spent so many years and obviously a lot of money with this engine program, and to walk away after their lack of success, to put it nicely, with McLaren would just not look good for them. I mean, you go back, it's not really all that long ago that Honda pulled the plug on their own works team, which became Braun GP, which won a world championship in their one and only season as a manufacturer, which was then bought out and is now the Mercedes team. So you look at that, I mean, they don't have a great track record in the sport recently, at any rate. And I know that from reading
Remember Bar Honda? How that was? Like, we should know. We should have known. We should have seen it. Right? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on you. Fool me 3 times, shame on me. And shame on us for believing Honda could bring it this time around. The 70s are a long, long time away. Like, it's long far gone.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm skeptical. I'll be honest. I'm skeptical whether or not they can get things better with Toro Rosso. I really doubt that they will, but you never know.
Well,
and
you know what the weird thing is? Listening to Christian Horner talking about this, for 2018, it doesn't really change anything. But for 2019, they would not have a Renault engine for Red Bull. So they'll be needing a new manufacturer. So they might need to go with Honda. What if Honda destroys destroys Red Bull after destroying McLaren? You know, that's in the very, very possible future. And yes, there's other option, and there's big names like Porsche and Aston Martin that are maybe thinking of producing engine for the 2020 season and the future after that. But you have to get there, and yes, 2018 is assured, but 2019... What about Red Bull? Because of this deal and the fact that Renault cannot necessarily supply number one team competing with Renault at that level past 2018, that was the original plan when they decided to take over Lotus, it becomes a complicated situation, and Red Bull will have to find a way to either make Honda with Toro Rosso work, so they have a good relationship with them, and then Honda can supply good engines, which they don't have yet, but maybe they will at that point, to Red Bull. But if not, Red Bull can be left in a conundrum for the 2019 season.
And it's interesting too, like you're saying, with manufacturers like Porsche on the skirts of Formula One, just kind of looking in and maybe considering jumping in at some point. I think we'll really get an indication how serious they are is once they finally decide on what the post 2020 engine regulations are going to look like, and whether or not it's going to be attractive for some of these other big manufacturers to come into the sport in one capacity or another as either an engine supplier or actually launch their own team. So until then, it's a bit of a question, but you raise a very good point. What with Toro Rosso getting the Hondas and Red Bull's own engine supply conundrum issues or whatever it might be in the next couple of years, is that with having them supplying Toro Rosso gives them the opportunity to get a really good look at the situation and find out what's going on almost from the inside. Obviously, the Toro Rosso is Red Bull's junior team, so there's going to be a lot of back and forth between them, even though they're fairly freestanding and whatnot. But it does give them.
Tell you something. There's probably a back end somewhere where Christian Horner will get every single data he wants in real time.
Oh, I'm sure that that he probably will, and then that way they can make an informed decision. But it's if you kind of look back at the last couple of years, I mean, they have not really been all that happy with the Renault engines. What was it, 2014 or 2015? I think they were basically threatening to pull out of Formula One because the Renault engine wasn't good enough, but which seemed like a little bit extreme just because that one engine wasn't delivering the goods. Why would you pull the plug on the entire program? Why wouldn't you just try to go and get a different one?
Yeah, but Mr. Mateschitz and how he goes with negotiating, and when he's not happy, you never know. Like, he pulled the plug on things way quicker than he could with Red Bull. He pulled the plug on his plane series quick enough when he was tired of it. So you never know what's going to happen with Red Bull when you look at it in a long time. And it was always possible as well, Red Bull, that it could become a team that he sells or another sponsor comes in to replace Red Bull. It's never was assured that Red Bull will be Red Bull forever.
Yeah, well, I was looking back just the last, I think within the last week at some of the evolution of the teams. I mean, Formula One teams aren't really a franchise as you might see in North American sports. And yeah, it's like a charter. I mean, because you look at, say, like in the NFL or the NBA, the NHL, etc., you basically have a franchise, and sometimes they get moved from city to city, but you still have like the same owners. But I was kind of looking back, okay, well, the evolution of Mercedes, I just kind of like touched on it. I mean, if you kind of go back through the years, go back from before Mercedes to Braun to Honda, back even further. It was Bar, and before that it was
before it was nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, before that it was Tyrrell Racing, which
it was Tyrrell. It's true.
Which is, was a team that was iconic in the 1970s. I mean, that's where Jackie Stewart won his 3 world titles. So, but I mean, it's different in that sense because, I guess maybe with Braun, being taken over by Mercedes, there was a lot of the people there, and I know that Braun kept a lot of the people from Honda, and it kind of morphed from there. But it's kind of interesting how you see it change through the years. But who knows what could happen with Red Bull? I hope they don't pull the plug. But go ahead, Kevin.
Sorry, I just had a flash, an idea, and I have to share it with you right now on air. This off-season, you know what we need to do at least once? A retro show where we take a Grand Prix of maybe our childhood or maybe from the 70s or the 80s, and if one that we can watch and we can tell our listeners in advance, and we watch a Grand Prix and we talk about that Grand Prix. I think it could be a great way to fill the gap this winter.
I think that's a great idea. And it's funny you should mention that, because I was thinking when I was going back and just rewatching some of the Singapore Grand Prix last weekend and the whole first corner incident, I was thinking, when was the last time I saw something like that happen? And then I thought back to the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix when I watched that as a kid, and when Senna and Prost collided at the chicane and took each other out of the race. I mean, a completely different set of circumstances, but that was Senna just basically shutting the door and not letting Prost by, and therefore basically sealing his own world championship. It wasn't, it was intentional compared to unintentional with Raikkonen and Vettel, but I think that's a great idea. And that Grand Prix, that 1989 Japanese Grand Prix, that's one I'd love to go back. So if I get to pick one, I think I'm going to pick that one.
And if the listeners have any suggestions, Scuderia F1 podcast at gmail.com. and let us know your suggestions. Which Grand Prix should we review in the off-season? But there's still a long ways to go, Mark, before we get to the off-season. We talked about Red Bull and Renault. It's actually a Tag Heuer branded engine, and he meaning Christian Horner, kind of let things slip in the weekend before the actual announcement, saying, our partnership with Aston Martin is probably going to grow. We'll talk about it more in the next few days. And now it's been kind of announced that Aston Martin will be the name of the Renault tagged engine. So it will be Red Bull Aston Martin.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, they do have this sponsorship agreement with them right now, but as it stands, it's just a little tiny Aston Martin badge right at the front of the nose on the Red Bull. So for them to actually take a bigger role is quite interesting to see, and it makes me really wonder what their long-term plans are in Formula One. You were saying a little bit earlier that maybe they're looking at it in the future.
Yeah, but it's too early for 2019. That's why there's a problem. That's why even Christian Horner, when he was asked by Sky Sports, he was non-committal for 2019 in many different aspects.
Yeah, well, let's hope that they do something. I remember watching a DTM race at Hockenheim years ago, and the Aston Martin were there as well, and it was fantastic to watch. So that's a mark that you'd love to see in a different racing series, and it'd be nice to see them take a more prominent role in Formula One. And that's why I also think it's interesting too that Porsche keeps their name keeps getting tossed around as well. So you take some of these rumors like Aston Martin and Porsche, and what was it, last week or the week before, that up to 40 potential venues have put sort of reached out to Liberty Media to host a Grand Prix. It's just that now we're at least almost a year removed from the Ecclestone era. Just how the interest in the sport from outside is starting to really sort of become more noticeable, and we didn't really see that as much in recent years. And then you also look with how they've really upped their social media game, and just how already in the first year, I mean, there's small steps. I mean, obviously it hasn't grown into this big juggernaut and really have become more prominent on the world sporting scene, but already we're seeing this the Liberty Media effect, and we'll see where it goes from here. Whether or not they're going to get more people vying for Grand Prix, how many more teams might potentially join Formula Ones, how many might actually potentially leave, or how many new engine manufacturers would come in. But it seems for once we're talking about Formula One for the right reasons, for the stuff that's going on off the track.
It's not about one guy trying to put more money in his pocket. It's about maybe a corporation that paid a big price for it. Now they're trying to make it work for their profit, yes, but to make it what they think it deserves to be at this point too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, obviously, I think being based in North America like we are, the one big step that they need to do over here is make the sport more prominent and get people interested, especially in the United States.
You know what? I think it's easy. Just make F1 look like NASCARs. Like, leave it as open wheel, like the same cars, but just paint schemes. Like, make it like NASCAR. You make it like, I know there's a lot of sponsors, but it's the way that they're put is a little differently. I don't know. There's something to be said there. I don't know. I keep being fascinated, Mark, by how NASCAR is popular in the state, and how once you start to pay attention, it's a fascinating sport, totally different motorsport than Formula One and open wheel. But it's fascinating how it is so popular in a way that Formula One dreams to be. Like, week in, week out. Yeah, it's a long season, and you have races where there's not a lot of people show up, but you have hundred thousands of fans showing up many times throughout the season, and it's kind of a goal that Formula One wants for the race that they do in the United States, which for years and years failed to reach the scale of a NASCAR event.
Yeah, and it's funny too. I was just thinking when you were talking about make them look more like NASCAR, and the first thing that immediately popped into my head is that I might not know a lot about NASCAR, but if I watch a NASCAR race, it's immediately obvious to me which car is being driven by who, because it has this huge number painted on the roof. So it's fairly easy to figure out which driver is which. But I mean, only this year and only halfway through the year did Formula One introduce these new rules for numbering or identification on the cars. And before, I mean, you had like the Red Bull that had this little tiny number for either Verstappen or Ricciardo on the side of the car. And it's almost impossible to figure out who's who. I mean, you basically look at whose helmet is sort of poking out the top of the cockpit, and if you can tell from the color scheme, then that's okay. But I mean, it is so much easier to identify a car in NASCAR, just because even within the same team, the cars might have the same body, but they have a completely different paint scheme, completely different sponsors on it, and it is so much easier to figure out who's who. But I mean, at least Formula
I just had
One.
Another idea. Imagine an utopian world where you don't need sponsors in Formula One, okay? Where the cars and the paint schemes can be just like goalie mask in hockey, just an expression of that person, of that personality, of their likes. And you have Lewis Hamilton with an amazing lion paint scheme on the entire car that looks like a lion going across the track. And you have Vettel with, I don't know, what could be Vettel? I don't know. You have a.
Well, he changes his paint scheme on his helmet every week. So
yeah, so he changes all the time. But
do
you
the
have
same
like
thing on
something
his
else.
car.
But you know what I mean? Like you have
Yeah.
Felipe Massa, a Panther, or like paint schemes that would reflect their personalities, and then fans would fall in love with the paint scheme. Fans would fall in love with the iconography and with the perception that it's a star in that car. And I think sometimes it's missing. Sometimes it's the emphasis on the car, and people can't relate to that. That's one thing about NASCAR, I think, that we always forget. It's not about the car. It's about the guy who drives it. It's always about their name, the media surrounding NASCAR. It's always about the drivers. There's rivalries. There's drama. And I think Formula One does not benefit by shying away from it. They benefit from embracing it. And I think Liberty Media, if there's some ways that they can favor making stars, or not necessarily making drama, because it's different in open wheel and you can't necessarily have the same type of racing that you have in NASCAR. But if you just take the core out of it, make it about the drivers, not about the cars.
Yeah, I do think just touching on one issue you mentioned there, I think that one thing that they did a couple of years ago and with the prior regime was switch to these, what do they call it, the personal numbers. So you know that Lewis Hamilton is 44, you know, Kimi Räikkönen is number 7, and it's going to change, or it's not going to change each and every year as it did in previous years. The one thing that I do kind of miss from the old numbering system is that, you know, the world champion got number 1, but at least it is easier to follow each and every year, because when you get to the first race of the season, you're not sitting there for the first couple of races trying to remember numbers because it's completely changed from the year before. Yeah. So that does help. But yeah, I wonder what they could do to make it more about the drivers, like you say, rather than about like the cars and the strategies. But I guess that's a very Formula One thing. That's why they have 2 championships that run parallel to each other, the drivers and the constructors championship, because it is, it's about both of them. And as fans, I think we tend to focus more on the drivers championship, because we all have our own favorite driver. Maybe it is a guy that drives for a specific team, or maybe it's just one guy and it doesn't matter if he drives for Ferrari one year and Mercedes the next, or McLaren the year after. You know, that's always going to be the guy that we cheer for. But if there's anybody that can pull that off or find a way to make it Formula One more appealing on that sort of level, I think that would be Liberty Media, because that's what their background is. That's what their expertise is. And if nobody can figure out a way to do it, then I guess they might be the only people that could.
You need an American superstar, to be quite honest, too. Like, you need an American driver that's actually good, actually wins races in Formula One. If you truly want to be in the United States market, let's be honest here.
Well, let's just take some sort of like, I don't know, bizarre parallel universe that Lewis Hamilton isn't a Brit, but is an American. I mean, he seems to be fairly popular in America. He spends a lot of time there. But if he was actually an American driver, I wonder what that would do for Formula One in the States.
Like, Lewis Hamilton can walk in Paducah, Kentucky, and walk in the middle of the mall, and nobody will recognize him. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean. You need, like, a superstar that transcends that to make Formula One big in the United States, and needs to be an American. He never achieved that status as Lewis Hamilton from Britain.
Yeah, that's why I sort of just speculating what he could have done for the sport if he was an American and not a Brit. Yeah, but that's kind of like fascinating. I mean, the only American driver that's been in Formula One recently was Alex Rossi, who got like, what was it, a couple of races for Manor Racing? What was it, the year before last? Yeah, so I mean, it's not even a competitive team, right? Exactly, right? So we need somebody kind of like the modern version, I think, of like Mario Andretti, who has even more.
Imagine Michael Schumacher, like a Michael Schumacher type of career. If he's an American, trust me, Formula One's going to be a lot more popular than it is now.
Oh, I totally agree with you, Kevin. That would propel the sport to all new heights in the States. I have no doubt about it. I mean, I think that whatever would happen there would be mirrored here in Canada to a certain extent too. I mean, we have Lance who's in the sport now, but I mean, most people, unless you're a Formula One fan, are not going to know who Lance Stroll is. And I think a lot of casual people might know the name Villeneuve. Maybe not so much because of Jacques, but I'm just sort of talking about casual people on the street. I mean, most motor racing fans are going to know that both Jacques and Gilles Villeneuve were in Formula One, and then Jacques won the Formula One World Championship in 1997. But that's kind of like one of those names that people seem to know, but sometimes maybe they don't know or really understand what it really means. But we need another good driver that has prominence here as well, because you kind of go back 20 years, 15 years when Jacques was in Formula One, and it was talked about a lot more. And since he left, it really has kind of fallen off the map here a little bit. So who knows what Lance Stroll can do with that. I mean, it's a lot to ask of a guy who's only 18 and only just joined the sport this year, but who knows?
A win goes
right?
a long way. That's what I'm saying. Winning goes a long way. That's what's needed.
Yeah, that's true. And he came so close and finishing second at Azerbaijan, but that awful mean Valtteri Bottas pipped him right at the very end to take second place.
Yeah, for second, for third, yeah.
Yeah,
that
cool.
was close.
Well, Kevin, I think that's a good place to wrap it up this week. Before we go, what's going on the network this week?
Soccer today, Monday to Friday. A lot of the talk of the NASL this week. If you are a soccer fan and you're in the United States and North American scene, probably heard about the North American Soccer League suing USSF. We had a special guest this week on the show to talk about this. A big win for the Montreal Impact tonight against Toronto, so I kind of have to say it in Toronto. So we'll talk about this all week long on Soccer Today, and you can find every show we do on sportspodcastingnetwork.com, and follow me on Twitter at Kev Laramée, as well on Facebook.
Very cool. And of course, you can follow this show on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod. And that's it. That's a wrap. We'll be back again this time next week, and we'll be talking about the Malaysian Grand Prix. And then after that, we are going to be counting down the races somewhat quickly, but we'll not try and get ahead of ourselves. Let's try and enjoy them, each and every one at a time, because before you know it, it will be the off season. And like you say, we will be looking for things to do. But before then, there's plenty of Formula One racing to come. And of course, the big question on everyone's mind at the moment is whether or not Sebastian Vettel can pull back those points and maybe give Lewis a bit of run for his money. But until then, that's a wrap, and we'll catch you again this time next week.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.